Chapter 9, Behavior and Misconduct, Part 4. Well, we've been considering the different factors that influence police behavior. Now, in this PowerPoint, we are going to specifically examine misconduct, misbehavior. And so this is a subset of police behavior, when police engage in deviance or misconduct. Your book outlines different types of deviance and misconduct. There may be occupational deviance. So this is when an officer just isn't a very good police officer, to put it bluntly. Their conduct is not up to professional standards. So they're always messing up. Or maybe they only mess up occasionally. Either way, maybe it's only one instance of occupational deviance. But did they forget to file a report? Did they improperly search someone? And it's not because they knew they were improperly searching. It's because they really don't know the rules. I mean, there was a police officer in my home county who was the police chief of a one-person police department. So he was the only person. He was police chief, but he was the only police officer. He messed up so many cases that finally the district attorney in my county finally said to all the defense attorneys, and there weren't any, this was a pretty rural county, there weren't very many defense attorneys, but word got around to all of them from the prosecutor that he would never prosecute another one of these cases from this particular police officer, because he just messed up all the time and embarrassed the prosecutor and wasted his time. There were so many of his cases that were thrown out because he'd screwed up things. So I mean, this would be an example of occupational deviance. This officer just wasn't well trained. He wasn't a very good police officer. He probably shouldn't have been a police officer at all. And finally, the system reacted to him by just saying, we're not going to prosecute any of your cases. And so the defense attorneys knew that the prosecutor, even if it was potentially a serious crime, the officer probably wouldn't oppose any motion that they made to dismiss the case. Because this prosecutor was trying to send a message to this police officer that I am not taking on your cases anymore. You've embarrassed me one too many times. Now, fortunately, this police officer was in a very small community, so there weren't very many really serious crimes that were going on. So, if something really serious happened, probably the state police would have been called in anyway to take over for him. But again, we can find these kinds of officers who just aren't competent. Maybe they mess up in one situation, or maybe they mess up continuously. So occupational deviance refers to that, messing up on the job in essence. Police corruption refers to misconduct that is aimed towards personal gain. So this police officer is doing something corrupt, something that they're not supposed to be doing, and it's for the purpose of enhancing their own personal financial situation or getting a benefit out of it that they wouldn't be entitled to. So this could be, again, money. This could be favors, maybe even sexual favors. This could be outright stealing. The police officers, perhaps, a police officer gets a call about a burglary alarm at Best Buy, and the officer is the first and only one at the scene. And before anyone else shows up, the police officer goes in, sees that there has been a burglary, some things have been taken, but the police officer decides to take a few things himself or herself. I'm going to pick up a couple iPods. I'm going to pick up, well, nobody uses iPods anymore, so I'm showing my age. I'm going to pick up some iPads. I'm going to pick up some computers. I'm going to pick up some smartphones, maybe a TV. I'm going to put them all in the back of my cruiser before anybody gets here. Okay, so that's another form of corruption. Kickbacks from drug dealers to look the other way, or other criminals. The things that, if you watch the video that featured Michael Dowd that I assigned on Canvas, the things that he was doing. I mean, he was basically protecting drug dealers against the police. He was serving as part of their muscle, and he was getting paid to do it. So this would be corruption for personal gain of some kind. Abuse of authority is when you're not trying to benefit yourself financially or personally, but you're the officer who is maybe beating suspects to get a confession out of them. Think, if you remember the old TV show 24 with Jack Bauer. He's going to hook up the electrodes and torture somebody to get information out of them. Well, he's not doing it for personal gain, or he's not doing it because he doesn't know better. He knows fully well that this is against the law, that this is unconstitutional, but he doesn't care because he's going to get that confession out of that person. Well, this would be abuse of authority, excessive use of force, unlawful searches, and again, it's not because you don't know better, it's because you don't care about the law. You're showing a disregard for the law. So you're violating people's rights, and you know that you're violating people's rights. So these are 3 different types of police deviance misconduct. Deviant officers. If we especially focus on corrupt officers. So if we go back to corruption, again, this is misconduct for personal gain. We can really separate the corrupt officers into 2 broad categories: meat eaters and grass eaters. And you can probably guess who are the most serious, the most dangerous. Would you fear a dinosaur who's a grass eater or a dinosaur who's a meat eater? The meat eater. And so meat eaters are the more aggressive, the more serious offenders. Grass eaters, in some situations, we might not even want to label them as corrupt. So for instance, if a police officer goes into a convenience store, and I'm not going to get into the big debate about Sheetz and Wawa, but let's assume they walk into one of those places, either Sheetz or Wawa or 7-Eleven or whatever it might be in your neighborhood, and they get the free cup of coffee, the free soda drink. If that's the extent of corruption in our police department, I think we've got a pretty honest police department. If they're not abusing it, they're not going in with their 10-gallon Gatorade jug and filling up for their softball tournament. If they're just having a cup of coffee, if they're just having a drink, and even though they're getting something that the general public doesn't get, I couldn't walk into Sheetz and just get a fountain drink and walk out. But police can do it because Sheetz, Wawa, 7-Eleven, whoever, they're doing it as saying, well, we know police are hardworking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Come in and get a free cup. It's not costing them much. It's costing them a few pennies, if anything. It's not, and so we would probably say this is about the lowest level of corruption, and maybe something that, we need to keep an eye on it and make sure it gets out of hand. But if that's all it is, then we're not too concerned about it. Meat eaters, on the other hand, they're the Michael Dowds from the video. They're the ones who are actively going out and aggressively engaging in corruption. They're taking down thousands of dollars. They're stealing. They're using drugs. They're selling drugs. They're doing, there have been stories of New York City police officers who were out doing hits for the mob. Frank Serpico is a famous New York City police officer. We'll talk more about him in a few minutes. But Frank Serpico exposed corruption in the 1960s in the New York City Police Department. And he was able to show that it was extensive, that it pervaded the police department, that there were officers taking down thousands of dollars each week to look the other way when drug dealing was going on, or other crimes like gambling and prostitution. So the meat eaters are the more serious. And so what are some of the factors that will influence our classification? Well, we'd have to ask, is there a quid pro quo relationship? What we mean by this is there a this for that relationship that's existing? I'm giving you something. I'm giving you that free cup of coffee, but I want you to look the other way when I do some crime within my store. If that was the case at the convenience store, now, if the officers accept it, they're willing to sell out for a free cup of coffee. First of all, they're pretty cheap. But secondly, if they're looking the other way as maybe drug dealing is going on because they're getting some free cups of coffee, well, then maybe they're getting closer to being classified as a meat eater. Think of it as a spectrum between meat eating and grass eating and zero corruption. But the quid pro quo relationship is more serious than a relationship where there isn't any. So again, with convenience stores, Sheetz and Wawa and 7-Eleven really aren't expecting the officers to do anything because we gave them a free cup of coffee. They're not expecting the officers to look the other way. At most, they're hoping officers come in regularly to their stores so that if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and somebody's thinking of robbing them, they might think twice because you never know when a cop's going to show up for that free cup of coffee. But that's so watered down that that's not really a quid pro quo relationship. Quid pro quo relationship is when I'm a drug dealer and I give you money to look the other way or give me information about any raids that are going to happen against me or anything like that. That's a quid pro quo relationship. I'm expecting you to do something for me. The seriousness of the corruption. Again, are we talking about a free cup of coffee or are we talking about thousands of dollars? There's a difference there, obviously. How aggressive is another concern. So if with the seriousness, how aggressive are the officers passively, accepting that free cup of coffee? And if the convenience store suddenly said, no, we can't give away free cups of coffee anymore, or the department forbids it, would they be all that heartbroken? they'd probably say, no, I'll pay for my, my dollar for my free cup of coffee. I got 25% off my meal. I'll tip the waiter more than I normally would. Those kinds of things. So am I being aggressive, or, hey, that's a nice little thing, thank you for giving that to me. You're not trying to influence me. It's a small thing. Your book calls it a gratuity. You're giving me a very small benefit for being a police officer. Okay, then I'm not being very aggressive about it. Or am I being aggressive? Am I, again, Michael Dowd, going out and looking for corrupt opportunities? Am I trying to seize upon them? Am I shaking people down? They don't want to pay me money, but I'm demanding it and I'm forcing them to pay up. Am I acting more like a criminal than a cop, basically? So how aggressive am I in seeking this corruption? How frequently am I engaging in it? Is this a one-time thing? Am I doing it more regularly? Is this a part of my standard practice as a police officer? Again, going back to New York has the most documented cases. They may not have the most cases of corruption, but they have certainly the most books written about corruption and most films and et cetera, about corruption in their ranks. But there were a group of New York City police officers back in the 1980s known as the Buddy Boys, who were basically acting as criminals for most of their shift instead of as police officers. They were taking drugs from drug dealers. They had actually gone out and rented a ground floor apartment that had a mail slot in the door where they could hand drugs out. Now, mind you, these officers were in uniform. They were handing drugs out and getting money back. And so they were making drug sales in uniform behind a door so nobody could see that they were actually police officers. But this was really their job day in and day out. They weren't really doing much policing. And so we would say, okay, that's pretty aggressive. It's pretty serious. The frequency is daily. Every day they're doing it for most of their shift. We're dealing with some pretty serious corruption at that point. Are we dealing with bad apples in a department or a rotten barrel? So when we look at any corruption in our department, is it really the work of just a few bad officers? If that's the case, then that's probably easier to root out than a rotten barrel. What I mean by rotten barrel is the department is corrupt. You can, again, find examples of this, unfortunately. The New Orleans Police Department has long had a history and a reputation for corruption. New York City, as I said, they've had major scandals almost every 20 years involving corruption and widespread corruption. So much so that you have to ask, as Frank Serpico did, is this really the way that the New York City police? Now, it seems they've cleaned up their act pretty well as far as corruption. It's a large department with over 30,000 officers, so we'd still expect to have some bad apples. But have we gotten rid of the systematic corruption? In Serpico's time, he felt that when he kept trying to report corruption, his supervisors kept dissuading him. They basically were trying to sweep it under the rug. Basically, the thought was, it's going to be during the late 1960s when there were a lot of riots and upheaval. It's going to be a long, hot summer. We don't want any scandals in the newspaper. The mayor is up for re-election. The mayor doesn't want to read in the New York Times front page or the Post or the Daily News or any of the other papers that there's a major scandal happening in the New York City Police Department. So they would rather sweep it under the rug than actually deal with it. Well, this is more rotten barrel, meaning that corruption has basically become part of the fabric of this department. Now, I've had some experience with the Pennsylvania State Police, and a friend of mine is a prosecutor who prosecuted some corrupt state troopers. And I have to say that my experience with the Pennsylvania State Police is that integrity and honesty is really a fabric of their culture, a part of their culture. And so when they had any hint that there were some corrupt police officers, corrupt state troopers, they actively pursued them and prosecuted them. So I would not say that the Pennsylvania State Police, at least in terms of corruption, the Pennsylvania State Police are a rotten barrel. I've seen no indication that they've turned their backs on any kind of scandal, any kind of corruption. Instead, they've seemed to go after those officers. So I would be more inclined to say if there's corruption in the Pennsylvania State Police, at least on what I've seen, it's bad apples. It's a few bad officers. New York, New Orleans, at times in their history, maybe not so much now with New York City Police, but in the past, I would be more inclined to say it was a rotten barrel. They were more concerned about their public image than they were about actually getting rid of corruption. And so they would parade a few bad cops in front of the TV cameras, claim to have cleaned up the corruption, but it would continue to go on and on and on. What allowed it to go on? Why do we still have police corruption? Well, we could say that, in any group there are going to be some people who don't have integrity and honesty. But beyond that, one of the factors that influences the persistence of corruption is the fact that police largely, are unchallenged. We want oversight. We want oversight from within the department. We want oversight from external agencies. We want the police. We want the prosecutors. Or not the police, we want the public, we want the press, the prosecutors to be watching the police from the outside to make sure that they're not engaging in corruption. We also want the police to police themselves. But, as many corrupt officers have said, who's gonna say no to a cop? A cop on the street largely acts without supervision. Yeah, as we said, they might have body cams, they might have people filming them, there might be, supervisors out on the streets, but largely they're operating without direct supervision. They have a lot of autonomy, and they may feel, if they're corrupt, that they're above the law. Who's going to do anything to a corrupt police officer? And if there isn't some framework, some oversight in place to actually say, we will, we're going to deal with corrupt officers. We're the Pennsylvania State Police. We take it seriously. We are going to track you down and prosecute you if you're corrupt. No matter if it gives us a blemish on our public reputation. If there's not that safeguard, if not there isn't that oversight, then the police may feel they're above the law and they're immune from any kinds of prosecution. What about the political and community environment? So do we have a political environment that is also maybe corrupt, or they don't want to challenge the police because the police are too powerful? And maybe the mayor is weaker than the police chief, or maybe the community isn't very well organized. They don't feel like their complaints are going to be taken seriously, and maybe they're not being taken seriously, or maybe they just don't care. Maybe they're mostly behind their locked doors and they're not going to see anything, they're not going to hear anything, they're not going to say anything. And so again, these factors can allow corruption to prevail. Widespread tolerance among citizens for some kinds of deviance. So maybe the public even wants the police to be deviant. So here maybe we're not talking about corruption, maybe we're talking more about deviance. Maybe the public says, yeah, rough up those gang members. If you remember, Donald Trump said, hey, don't be so gentle with them when you put them in the car. So maybe there's that similar kind of notion. Why are we coddling criminals? Rough them up a little bit. If you want to beat them a little bit to get a confession out of them, if you're Jack Bauer and you've got to hook electrodes up to them and shock them until they talk, good, let's do it. If we've got a waterboard, let's do it. So is there acceptance among citizens to do certain things that are improper, that are illegal? So this might influence corruption. Have patterns of deviance become standard practice? So as we talked about in the last slide, in New York, at certain times in New York City Police Department's history, in New Orleans and other police departments, has deviance become a way of doing business, violating people's rights, engaging in corruption, doing those kinds of things? If it is, then again, we may have a rotten barrel and not some rotten apples. Additional factors influencing misconduct: opportunity, certainly. If you're a police officer in State College, you're probably not looking at the kinds of drug dealing that you might find in Philadelphia or New York or other kinds of things where you could be bringing down thousands of dollars a week. And also, so you just don't have the opportunity to engage in this misconduct because you don't have that kind of drug dealing going on in your community. At least it's not easily tapped into. So if you're a police chief and you're coming into a particular police department and you're concerned about corruption, you want to know if there's corruption, the units that have the most opportunity for corruption are probably the vice units, the ones that are dealing with so-called victimless crimes. Gambling, prostitution, drug use, drug dealing, those kinds of things. If they're considered victimless, then that implies that you don't have somebody who's really clamoring for the police to do something. The person who's taking the drugs isn't going to run out to the police and say, hey, arrest me because I've just taken the drug. Unlike if that person had been assaulted by someone else. They might go out and say, I've been assaulted, please help me. I've been had some other crime. I've been robbed. I've been raped. Someone has been killed in my family, whatever. In those situations, they're going to demand that the police act. But in vice situations, people want to flaunt the law. They don't think the law should be enforced, perhaps, because they're actively participating in it. They're using drugs, they're gambling, they're prostituting, they're doing whatever. And so these are areas where historically corruption and misconduct have been most common, especially corruption, if we're talking about vice operations. The culture, do we have a culture of honesty like we talked about with the Pennsylvania State Police, or do we have a culture of dishonesty? Leadership. Do leaders send a strong message that corruption and misconduct will not be tolerated? Or are they more concerned about the public image of the police department? And I'd rather cover something up than actually expose it. If that's leadership, then corruption is probably going to continue to grow. Politics. As I mentioned Serpico before, Frank Serpico, the New York City cop. He found that the politicians really didn't want to do anything. The police supervisors didn't either, but the politicians didn't want a whole lot done about corruption because they didn't want any kind of major scandal that might tarnish them as well. And so politics can play a role. We talked earlier about the Rodney King law that allows the federal government to essentially take over a police department if necessary. But I don't think you're going to see many prosecutions under that law during the current administration. And so politics have played a key role under Republicans. Those prosecutions tend to be uncommon. Under Democrats, they've tended to be much more common, that we're going to actually bring actions against the police to try to clean them up. So again, politics may play a role. The work environment. Do the police officers actually feel like they're justly paid and supported? So are they actually, do they have job satisfaction? Do they have something to hold on to? If you actually feel like you're getting paid pretty well and that you're getting good support, that you're actually satisfied with your job, you're less likely to take the risk to lose it all by engaging in misconduct or corruption. So we've raised the standards of policing so that police officers actually are paid better. Pennsylvania's state trooper gets over $60,000 coming out of the academy. So that's not bad. And by the time they retire, they're able to retire at a relatively young age. At 25 years, they're able to retire with 75% of their highest annual salary. So if they've done even a modest amount of overtime in a particular year towards the end of their career, they're probably getting paid $75,000 or more in retirement at age 47 or 48. So do I really want to take the risk of giving that up to engage in some corruption? Probably most people would say no. That's a pretty secure future. Stress. Stress can affect misconduct, not just corruption, but misconduct. The abuse of people's rights, those kinds of things, in a dramatic fashion. So I have some video about Hurricane Katrina in the police department. And during Hurricane Katrina, the officers didn't even know if they were going to live. And they were working around the clock nonstop. And so they were going without sleep and a natural disaster that they might not survive. And so their stress levels were pretty high. And they were already, New Orleans, as I said, it was already a problematic police department. Well, when you throw in a hurricane that has devastated the city, you have just maxed out the stress levels, and you've just designed or put together the perfect recipe for problems. And there were a lot of problems in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And so stress, we need to make sure that the police officers are able to deal with stress, that they're able to handle it. Can we pull them out of a situation? One of the situations with the highest likelihood for excessive use of force is actually a high-speed chase. So when those officers have been in a high-speed chase for a long period of time and they finally catch the person, it almost is human nature, because your adrenaline is off the charts, to just get out and want to beat that person. Why did you run from me? Why did you put my life at risk? All these kinds of things. And so we've learned that we need to manage high-speed chases better, because we don't want the additional problem of excessive use of force. So high-speed chases are dangerous in and of themselves, but the aftermath can be can result in police beatings, excessive use of force, those kinds of things. So can we manage it so that the police officers are only in the high-speed chase, if they're in it at all, they're only in it for a short period of time. There's kind of a relay system where the lead officer backs off and another officer comes in. We're doing that because we don't want that officer to be so stressed out when they finally catch the person that they're just going to beat that person. So stress is another factor influencing misconduct. Justifications. Do officers come up with a bunch of justifications for why they acted? Again, Jack Bauer from the television series 24. I may be breaking the laws, but I'm doing it for the right reasons. I'm going to save lives because I'm going to beat this terrorist until that terrorist gives me information about the location of the bomb, and I'll find the bomb and I'll save lives. Do officers use this justification? I'm taking the money from these drug dealers and taking their drugs, and that's going to hit them harder than if I had arrested them and took them into the courts. The courts don't do anything. I'm hitting them where it hurts. Yeah, but you're breaking the law also. And so, you might come up with a bunch of justifications, but it still doesn't make what you're doing proper, professional, or legal.